I wanted to share some thoughts on auxiliary percussion or rack percussion as I was here today setting things up. And it's an area where there can be a lot of questions. And typically there are relatively young percussionists playing the parts, and so they don't always have the answers. For that reason, I spend kind of a disproportionate amount of time working on setting up rack percussion in my front ensembles, because I expect that by the time you get down there to one of those instruments, that you've been a part of the group and that you know what you need to do. And so you should be closer to self-sufficient than down here, since it is typically a newer player who's playing. That being the case, I start trying to write the parts as sort of multi-percussion parts with a few instruments per person. I do make sure that there's a clear difficulty difference between the two. So percussion 1, I typically write a little more advanced than percussion 2. Though they both have instrument swapping, there's a little more instrument swapping in percussion 1 than in percussion 2. And the percussion parts in percussion 1 typically tend to be more rhythmic articulation, and the parts in percussion 2, suspended cymbal swells, single impacts, things like that. Again, this is an educational ensemble, so I want to make sure that you progress from here to there, but you have to have somewhere to start. And so I try to give a nice beginning place in the parts that I write. Then it extends to the setup, making sure that everything is ready to go for everybody whenever they come in. Because again, if you expect your rack player who's a beginner to set up the rack, then it's probably not going to be the best, most efficient setup. If they're a vet, then they're probably good to go. But if they're new, things will kind of be all over the place. Since both of mine are new, I want to make sure they're set up for success. So I put all the percussion 1 instruments, since it is more rhythmically motivated, over on the right side of the rack, which is the side nearer the center of the ensemble, so they're closer to where the rhythmic action is. I put all the instruments that only they use, so snare drum, ride cymbal, crash cymbal, splash cymbal, over here on that side of the rack. And the ones they share in the middle, typically we share mark tree, sizzle cymbal, so both players need to be able to reach those. And then over here is a suspended cymbal that player 2 would use. So there's 2 instruments that could be used as a suspended cymbal on here, since they have those potentially at the same time, and there's only 1 of everything else. Additionally, they back up to the back row where they have bass and tam. Those are all 2 famous BAMs. And both players have easy access to this since it's right behind them. So they're able to transition back to it and then back up to the front as they need. And I will have both players do that throughout the production. And next, after the instruments, make sure they all have implements and implement bags. I like to use these IP1s so that if they're playing on some sort of the drum, or they need an articulate cymbal sound, they can use the wooden end, but they can also shift over to the back for suspended cymbal rolls. It's a little harsh for suspended cymbal rolls, maybe in a percussion ensemble setting, but outside it's not as noticeable. And these are by far the most durable things I've found to use and the most versatile things to use. So we work around kind of the hardness of that felt end as opposed to a yarn end or something like that. Start the roll nice and low, and then only crescendo as the cymbal is warmed up, so that it's not too, you don't hear the contact of the felt on the end. But these are what I use typically for the rack. So I make sure there's a couple pairs up there, make sure the stick bags are where they belong, so they have lots of room to store things, and then they're good to go. On the back row, I do similar things. So I tack the mallet bags here to the side poles of the tam-tam rack. They're zip tied around this way, but then here in the center, I don't know if you can see this, they're also zip tied that way, and it's zip tie to zip tie, so this doesn't descend down that pole. It stays up near the top. I tend to put the rollers on the outside and a general beater on the inside. I do that for bass drum too, so the general bass drum beater is there. So if they're going to play a bass and tam strike, they can grab both of those at the same time, turn around and play, and then put the bass drum rollers over here. And if we need any more options than that, you know, I spread out around the drums, but this is typically where we start. I do include a black towel hanging on the drum. It's fastened at the top with these kind of page clips, paper clips, not a paper clip. I don't know what you call these, but these, it's fastened with those. It can hang down over the drum so that they can get a really articulate sound without having to use a hand to dampen it. They can play with both roller mallets for more articulate and rhythmically dense passages. You can also throw it off entirely. That would get essentially all the ring out of the drum. There would be no dampening. And also we haven't lost the towel. It's still hanging out there at the top, so whenever you need it, you can flip it back over. I do also cut off the this sort of edge down at the bottom. So at the bottom, that edge is thicker than that, and sometimes you can get a rattling sound if it's left on the drum. So I cut that off to help eliminate that. But I do include a towel because I'd rather have a towel and not need it than need it and not have it. So there is an overview of some of my thoughts on setting up your rack area, and more importantly, your auxiliary percussion students for success, for whenever we manage to get back to a field.